Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Today, our guest is Journal of the American Revolution contributor Scott Syfert, and he'll be talking to us about the Great Mech Deck and the mysteries that surround it. Scott, you've been on the show before. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
Scott, for those who don't remember, remind us about yourself.
So I'm a native Charlottean. Was a passionate lover of history in my collegiate days. Studied history at University of North Carolina in Virginia, but it was always European history, right? It was sort of military, World War II, and it was never American Revolutionary history or local history. And then when I got out of college, I'm a lawyer now at a law firm here in Charlotte. But I've always had a sort of passion for history generally. But someone was telling me this story of our local community, the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence story. And, and I thought, you're making this whole thing up. I've never heard this in my life. I grew up in Charlotte and spent my entire life here other than college. And I had never heard this whole wacky historical curiosity about how Mecklenburg County, which is where Charlotte is located, which was a frontier community in the Revolutionary War days, had been the first to declare independence from Great Britain. And what's more, that had been like a really big deal. It was a city and county holiday. It's the date on the North Carolina state flag, which virtually no one knows. And it has all these echoes from our region, and I didn't know anything about it. So that's sort of the background and how I got radicalized on this whole story. And then from there you go into Cornwallis and everything that happened in 1780 and so forth.
So Scott, we were talking a little bit before we aired. I focus a lot of my attention on the frontier of the Revolution, particularly the Ohio River Valley, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, and Kentucky. And to me, this story is a classic frontier story. Everything checks
Yeah.
out to me. The way people meet, the way people interact. So let's establish a little bit of background for those who don't know. Tell us about Mecklenburg County in 1775. I think it's so important. This is not
Right.
downtown Charlotte today, correct? This is a very different place.
That's it. And it's difficult to sort of reimagine what this whole area looked like, given the lens we all, see through now. But it was the frontier. It was the back country. It was sort of the farthest you could go in almost the farthest you go in the American colonies, circa 1775. You took the Great Wagon Road down from Delaware through Philadelphia into the woods. And so you have to think about what kind of people were motivated enough to want to do that. And they were religiously motivated. They were Scots-Irish. First, they were Scots-Irish, but second, they were Presbyterians. And not sort of Presbyterians as we think about them today, but, this was a radical sect back then. Especially this group, the Presbyterians, it was followers of a minister named Alexander Craighead. And they followed a militant strand, which was extremely anti-English and anti-Anglican church. And so they'd been kicked out of sort of the more civilized areas in Pennsylvania. So they went to live in a godly society as far away as they could get. And, back here on the frontier, amidst, no civilization, at the end of the road here, you're in the Indian lands, as they would say. And then that's it. You're dropping off the face of the world. So the whole story it's a frontier story. That occurs about 1775, and it was, there's few people here. There's probably 1,000 settlers total, more or less, in the county. There's very limited civilization. There's no brick buildings. It's not Boston or Philadelphia or Charleston with these beautiful, Anglican and English cultured structures. It's just wooden huts. And these people are, they're tough people. They're farmers. They're making a settlement here. They're coexisting with the local Indian tribes. And they got to where they got here because they were getting away from the British. And you see this 5 years later when the British show up in force and turn the entire area into what Cornwallis famously calls a hornet's nest of rebellion, where the teenagers and the women and children all pick up guns and shoot at the British from behind the trees and drive them out. So not to jump ahead of the story, but it's a frontier story, and it's, that's why it's an interesting story, but it's been a challenging one from a sort of legal document perspective, because there's very few documents that exist. There's almost no buildings that exist from this period. It's all oral history. It's all, family legend. It's all what was written on the tombstone out in the woods sort of stuff. So it's a great, if you like wonky, mystery, historical, detective stories, this is the story for you, as I tell people.
Absolutely. Yeah, the oral tradition weighs so heavy on the frontier. It's difficult to understand these people, but they are a very separate
Yeah.
people away from the consensus of the coasts. The way they
Yep.
are feeling is very much they're isolated in their world. It's so important to understanding this story or the frontier in general. They
Yep.
didn't see themselves like their coastal brethren any more than their brethren saw them that way. So, Scott, tell us the traditional story, because we're going to get into the murky
Right.
areas here. But give us the traditional story, May 1775 in Mecklenburg County.
The story, as the story goes, the 26 local Scots-Irish militia leaders are meeting in the log courthouse in the center of what is now downtown Charlotte, which is a wooden structure set atop 10-foot brick pillars, and there's a marketplace beneath it and so forth. It's the only real structure in town, but it's the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, and they're meeting there on May 19th to discuss the deteriorating set of events in the American colonies generally and what looks like impending civil war. And as they're meeting, a express rider shows up from Philadelphia who brings them news that the battles of Lexington and Concord have occurred exactly 1 month before on April 19th. And they go ballistic. And so over a period of 24 hours, they meet in the courthouse and they debate and they resolve upon a set of papers that we now call the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which is a very short sort of piece of paper, and it has 4 or 5 stanzas that say, we, absolve all allegiance to the British Crown. We hereby declare ourselves a free and independent people. And they do this. And so they debate this, they pass these resolutions. And then a week or so goes past, and they say, well, what do we do next? We're some frontier citizens living, on the fringe of civilization. What do we do? So they task a local tavern owner named Captain James Jack to say, go to Philadelphia and give these to our North Carolina representatives in Congress, who are then meeting at the Second Continental Congress. And Jack does this. For many years, he was called the Paul Revere of the South, and he was a well-known figure. Just as his story was much more well-known 100 years ago, which we can get into. So Jack goes to Philadelphia. He delivers the Mech Deck resolutions to the representatives. Congress at that time is debating what's called the Olive Branch Petition, which both Adams and Jefferson were both very vested in, which basically said, let's avoid civil war. Let's reconcile with Great Britain or find some means so that we don't devolve into war with the mother country. And everyone is more or less aligned on a path to try to do that. So when they get the message of these frontier people, hitting the gas on an independence movement, they say, whoa, 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 this is very premature. Thank you for your efforts. We appreciate what you're doing. And they send Jack back to Mecklenburg County. And there's plenty of documentation of Jack riding up there, where he went, who he saw, and so forth. So all that part of the story that I just told you is basically uncontested. The controversy becomes one of what are the papers he was carrying, which we can talk about. Because the original papers, for whatever they said, whatever the texts were, the original papers of the convention are lost in a home fire in April of 1800 at the house of a gentleman named John McNitt Alexander, who's the secretary of the convention. So we'll never know what exactly the paper said or who signed them or so forth. It all gets, many decades later, gets recorded by local memory of he was there and he was there and that guy was not there. This is what they said, and so forth and so on. But that's the Mech Deck story in a nutshell.
Okay, so this is very important we keep track of this. We have Captain Jack. There's a statue of him, I believe, in Charlotte. He is a real person beyond reproach.
And a beer.
Correct?
There's a beer also importantly named after him. Captain Jack Coker.
So we don't doubt he's real. We have plenty of documentation that he's carrying a message, some documents to the Continental Congress. We know he hands them over. Do we have any idea, if they were lost or hidden or kept from the other members of the Congress? Do we have any clue about what happens to them once the delegates get them in their hands?
We have some clues, and the only record we can point to is that he went to Philadelphia, because there's testimony of eyewitnesses who saw him there. There's record in the Moravian journals that say a messenger from Mecklenburg was sent north and he passed through our village here in August of 17. On his return trip, he was sending a delegation or message from a delegation in Mecklenburg about their belief in American independence and so forth. So all these hints about what that he went. So again, it's uncontested. Even the most anti-Mech guy will not say the Captain Jack story is invented. That's so
Independence in the Moravian account.
correct.
Word independence very clearly in there, correct?
Yes. So we've got the Moravian journals, which we could talk about in more detail. We've got the records of the British. So the one of the royal governor of North Carolina, Josiah Martin, writes a letter to Lord Germain in London, covering a number of these topics. But in one of his letters, he said, "I understand that the people in Mecklenburg have sent an express rider to Philadelphia with a copy of the resolutions. And, when we capture him, these treasonous people will be dealt with," something along those lines. So the British reference Jack, so you know what happened, but we don't know, and we can only speculate, and the accounts of who he met and so forth are all made 20, 30, 40, 50 years later. So they could be based on local, eyewitness testimony. We just don't know. So you have to be somewhat cautious about who said what and who he met. Jack himself only said he met with two, interestingly enough, not three of the delegates. But my view on this is, having looked at this in too much detail, is the delegates, especially from North Carolina, were very Tory-oriented. In fact, Jefferson calls one of them after the fact. He goes to Adams, he said, "You remember as well as I do, there was no greater Tory in Congress than Hughes." And so so imagine what they're like in 1775, and they got this message. It's the last thing they were temperamentally inclined to want to deal with. So this was just kind of not their thing. These weren't their people, right? They're gentlemen from the East Coast. And Jefferson and Adams later, when they're describing them, were very, very skeptical that they even wanted independence in 1776. So if you extrapolate from that, they had no interest in this. So did they, as politicians do they say, "Hey, thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. And I'll scram," and send him politely away? That's the most logical explanation. But the answer is we don't really know. We can only speculate about who said what and what the paper said because we don't have them.
It's very important to stress. I really don't believe those delegates felt the Scots-Irish of the frontier spoke for the colony in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. Let's talk about the British a little bit, Scott. You alluded to the British. Now, Mecklenburg County comes up in other papers. It has a reputation amongst the British.
Yes.
Just to kind of paint the picture a little bit. Tell us about Mecklenburg County in the eyes of the British. And again, take us through what you found referencing Captain Jack.
So the British papers are very interesting because they sort of corroborate the entire story. So all of the story is based on either eyewitness testimony or very credible eyewitnesses, or corroborating but circumstantial evidence about the whole story, right? And if you're a skeptic, you say, "Well, you don't have the papers, so I'm stopping with that," which is a very narrow and sort of, in my view, stilted way of looking at this, but be that as it may. So the British papers, for example, in the summer of 1775, Josiah Martin, the last royal governor, among other letters, writes to Germain, and he says, the newspaper enclosed with this letter, which your lordship will find, from a committee in Mecklenburg, resolutions surpass all the horrid and treasonable publications that the inflammatory spirits of this continent have yet produced. Well, what was he looking at? We don't know. So it was something, and Martin saw it, and Germain saw it. Now that paper, which is a different story, has also gone missing, which is interesting. So it's kind of this, it's one layer after the other. So the British, Martin says this, he references that an express rider has gone to Philadelphia and so forth. Now, if you jump ahead 5 years to the British occupation of Upper South Carolina in this area on the frontier, you have, Cornwallis saying, among other things, that, the county of Mecklenburg is more hostile to England than any place he'd been in the American colonies, including New Jersey. And Bannister Tarleton, the British Legion commander, famously writes in his memoirs that it had been frequently mentioned to the king's officers and was evident that the counties of Mecklenburg and Rouen, which is next door, were more hostile to England than any other in America. That's a pretty good quote, right? Not They really don't like us, or more hostile than any others. So that gives you, again, it's a circumstantial evidence, but again, that tells you the people that lived here. They were, again, Scots-Irish, they were anti-English, they were anti-authoritarian. And so when the Brits finally show up in force here, it turns into, a civil war that ends up with, among other things, Battle of Kings Mountain, in which they just destroy, almost to a person, the entire detachment of Cornwallis's cavalry. So that's an important fact when you're building the case that if there were a movement for independence in the American colonies prior to 1776 or so, where would it have occurred? And it could have only occurred in a place that has sort of that backstory, that has the temperament of those people living here, checks out, right? It's not going to happen. Maybe it occurred in some, very animated religious community in New England, but it makes sense that it would have occurred here, away from the coast, not wealthy people, Scots-Irish sort of, farmers and settlers.
Absolutely. So we're going to fast forward a few decades. Obviously, the war occurs, and people lose interest in debating who was first in independence. We see Thomas Jefferson and John Adams communicating about, of all things, a news update. Now, we live in a world today where we have to be skeptical of all of our news sources because there's so much quote-unquote fake news. This story sounded a little bit like that, at least to Thomas Jefferson, I think. Tell us that story.
So this story, so the Meck story, they pass these resolutions, they send Jack to Philadelphia and he comes home. So that's kind of the end of the story, and it really would have stopped there and no one would have heard about this or cared too much, frankly, right? Because it didn't really accomplish, if it stated its goal was to accelerate independence, it failed, right? It's interesting to reflect what happened, but it's kind of a historical curiosity of the area. The British then occupy the area in 1780. They tear everything down. They burn the homes. Everyone flees. So whatever papers or records or court documents are largely gone. I mean, the area's devastated, doesn't recover for years, which is part of that story too. So this whole thing would have been forgotten, or at best a sort of local curiosity that no one cares about, except there becomes a debate in the sort of 1820s among congressional folks as to who gets credit for the American Revolution, right? And the people in Massachusetts are like, the whole story's, Sam Adams and John Adams and the Boston Tea Party and so forth and Lexington. It's a Massachusetts story. We won the Revolutionary. We started it. And the people in Virginia say, no. It's Jefferson. It's Yorktown. It's a Virginia story, and so forth. And as this sort of national debate is going on, some people in Mecklenburg County, some congressional delegates say, well, you may not have heard this, but we actually had a movement for independence well before anybody else in May of 1775 in Mecklenburg County. And of course, people say, you're lying. Like, we haven't heard of this. Prove this. They said, okay. So they go back and they gather some eyewitness testimony and they find some papers that survive the fire. And sort of the foundational document that they find in one of the homes that's not burned is a account of the whole Meck story that we've just talked about. Including the text and the resolutions in the background. Now, it's undated, it's anonymous, no one knows who wrote it or when. Is it a recording of some other papers? It's so they don't know. So it's called The Copy in an Unknown Hand. And the people of Mecklenburg say, it doesn't matter. We all know this is a genuine story. It's been our family legend and we all talk about it locally. So they print this paper in the Raleigh Register newspaper. And a copy of that finds its way to then retired President John Adams. And this kicks this whole thing off. So Adams reads this and has an astonishing reaction in which he says, among other things, the genuine sense of America at that moment was never so well expressed before. What does that mean? Or since. And if I'd seen this, I would have, taken it to Congress and we would have had independence a year earlier, and just absolutely goes bananas. And he writes this to his then frenemy, Thomas Jefferson, in Monticello. And he writes a kind of snarky letter, right? A very passive-aggressive letter, like part of which I just quoted, in which he kind of intimates that, I never saw this. I wonder why that is. And, nothing has been better expressed before than this. So it's set up to really kind of antagonize Jefferson, and deliberately so, which I'll talk about in a second. Jefferson gets his Adams letter and is kind of nonplussed by it. And he receives it on the 4th of July, by the way, which must have been a little irritating too. So he writes a very lengthy 5 or so page letter back to Adams in actually quite reasonable and rational arguments in which he says, no historian that I have talked to has ever told me about this. No one records it. No one has heard of this Mecklenburg County, and so forth, and goes through the reasons that he thinks this is probably not true. Now, he doesn't say it's not true, I'm sure. He leaves the door open. He says, if more solemn proof can be authenticated, I could believe this, but for the moment, I must be a disbeliever in the apocryphal gospel. So Jefferson is very measured on this, but clearly, states the anti-argument that, why haven't I've never heard this either, no one we ever did. And that's when he gets into things like, and you remember as well as I do, how these Tories were the North Carolina representatives and so forth. So that kickstarts a whole argument about, he's debasing North Carolina and these Revolutionary War heroes. Adams, meanwhile, on a parallel track, thinks that he has finally caught Jefferson out. And he's caught Jefferson out because Jefferson must have seen this document. As he says, he must have seen it in the time of it, for he has copied it verbatim. So Adams thinks Jefferson has plagiarized from this wonky random document from Mecklenburg County that no one's ever heard of. And he's now got Jefferson. And who he doesn't like, who's never liked, and they're very polite in their discourse, but he's finally going to get him. So, and he writes privately to some others and says, I know that he's done this, send me more copies, and sets off a whole very defamatory line of argument against Thomas Jefferson that he's a plagiarist. And that sort of sends the whole argument in a number of different directions, because people become very pro-Jefferson. Then you think this is all a hoax and they're out to get him. Or if you are a pro-Adams or a Virginian or a North Carolinian, you think, yeah, Jefferson probably did this. So that takes the whole story down a whole side path that it didn't really need to go on to prove or disprove the veracity of the story. Because now, if you're vested in it, Jefferson's a fraud and he stole it, or the opposite.
Well, we wouldn't dare besmirch Thomas Jefferson writing that document with his bare hand in Philadelphia.
That's right.
But again,
especially then.
Politics never changes here. Two men's personal animosities muddying what should be otherwise a historical debate. So this is all going to be complicated. And that's the nice way of putting it. By something called the Mecklenburg Resolves. Maybe the worst thing to happen to the Mecklenburg Declaration are these resolves. Right. So tell us about them.
Yeah, and I'll try to keep this as simple as I can, and it took all of my lawyerly skills to sort of dissect this story over 20 years. But basically, in terms of the evidentiary trail, you've got you've got the copy in an unknown hand. You have some extant historical documents. Debate what they mean and so forth, but they exist. They've got to be discussed. You've got a series of eyewitnesses who come out in 1830 and make testimony, and they're all Presbyterian elders or Joseph Graham, who's a very famous militia leader. You've got they're very credible eyewitnesses. They all tell this Meckdeck story, but they tell it sort of 50 years after the fact. So it's reasonable to say, well, how much credibility can we give them? So that's all this evidentiary thing that's kind of swirling around in the mid sort of 1830s or 40s. And what you have to remember too, that this was a big national story about the veracity of this. This was like, as one person called it, one historian, this was the most mooted question in the history of the American Revolution, if you can believe that, in the 1830s. And presidents are vested in this, and senators, and it's a big deal. So as this is all kind of swirling around, the Jefferson-Adams thing makes everybody crazy. Historians are writing books and papers and articles and looking for more evidence. And one historian working in the Charleston Library finds in a newspaper of June 1775 an article, and it still exists. You can see it in the Charleston Library. It's pretty cool. But a June 1775 version of a local paper. And in it is a series of resolutions from Charlottetown, Mecklenburg County. And they're dated May 31st, 1775, and they're very lengthy. But they don't look or kind of sound or smell like what all the eyewitnesses said the Mecklenburg story was. The Mecklenburg story, and again, the papers don't exist anymore, so it's all based on, eyewitness testimony for us. But the eyewitnesses all say, we said we'd be free and independent, we're absolving allegiance to the British Crown, and so forth. Kind of short and sweet. And the papers that they find similarly kind of echo that. They're pretty succinct. This document in the paper is very lengthy. It's 20 resolutions, and it just doesn't look like a Declaration of Independence. It says, because the British have sort of abandoned and the Crown has, lost faith in us, we're setting up a government. We're, Brady, go buy the gunpowder. Court's meeting every third Tuesday. If you spit in the street, it's a 5-shilling fine and so forth like that. So what is this? And no one has people have explanations, but people don't know what this is. First of all, it's dated May 31st, not May 20th, which all the eyewitnesses say it happened on May 19th, May 20th, without exception. So these are 11 days later. They mention people that don't come up in the eyewitness accounts, Joe Kennedy, others, and they just don't feel like a Declaration of Independence. So if you're a believer in the story, you say, look, on May 20th, they declared independence. On May 31st, they had a separate meeting setting up their new system of government, right? So you have Declaration of Independence logically first, and then you have a constitution. So this is the bylaws of this new community. That's the argument. It's circumstantial evidence that the whole story is true. It's not the document, but it proves that this was all going on. Now, if you are a skeptic, if you're a Jeffersonian, you say, this is all that happened. So all the eyewitnesses, we're not saying they're lying because they're very good eyewitnesses. They're all credible Presbyterian elders and Revolutionary veterans, but it's 50 years later. So they're all misremembering a true event of passing these resolutions with a sort of fictitious Declaration of Independence, and they're conflating in their own minds the story 50 years later. Again, they're not lying, but they're misremembering something. And these resolutions, which we find, are very interesting, and they're fine, but they're not a Declaration of Independence. They look like anti-British resolutions of the period, but that's it. And that's pretty much so, as you say, it was the best and worst thing that could happen to the story because it confuses everyone. And basically, that's where the battle lines stand to this day, which is if you disbelieve these stories, you say, this is all that happened. And if you believe it, you say, this is part of a broader mosaic of evidence.
Yeah, Scott, your article is a classic analysis of sources, the kind of thing I get really excited about. So we'll kind of wrap up with just this question.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on the veracity of the Declaration itself? And how do you think this helps us understand this whole time period better?
So I of course, we started an organization called the May 20th Society 20 years ago. So we are avid supporters of the story. And, as we talked before we started, when we first got interested in this 20 years ago, this was not something you mentioned in polite society. This was like this idiotic hoax thing. And as I dug into it, you realize there's a lot of evidence here, quite a bit. Now, you can't find the one smoking gun to prove or disprove the story, which is fine. But our goal is to move the needle from it's a hoax, no one cares, back to a more balanced position of how do you deal with this? How do you deal with the eyewitnesses and so forth? So that's my view. Now, people that have sort of, there's an author, David Fleming, who wrote a very good book 2 years ago called Who's Your Founding Father, which is sort of his fun take on this whole thing. He started as a skeptic about what a silly story this is and became completely radicalized as he realized, holy cow, there's all this evidence that I had this completely wrong. So his point now is there's nothing to debate. Like, you got eyewitnesses saying this happened. You give them credit for the Battle of Hanging Rock or Colson's Mill. Why would you say they're lying about this? It's the same people. So why is there debate at all anymore? I'm sympathetic to that. I think, what does this all mean is to summarize, and the answer is, this whole story fell off the radar because 150 years ago, people really cared who got credit for the American Revolution, right? That was an important thing in civic pride. And that sort of dissipated quite a bit. So now that's part of the reason no one cares or cares less. But that's part of a broader problem with the study of history in the American Revolution generally. And so you could see a situation where, in 10 years, do people care about the American Revolution at all? And so this has been sort of collateral damage in this sort of degrading and forgetting of the revolutionary principles altogether. So part of our goal is simply to bring it back. And look, it's a fun story. The fact that it cannot be resolved and remains contentious is half the fun. Because the people that really, really don't like it and get animated and pissed off about it are great. You wonder why they're so motivated anyway. But that whole contention is what keeps this thing going for us. So
Yeah. Well, you're preaching to the choir with this show, Scott. Well, Scott, thank you so
right
much for
on.
joining us. And keep on searching, and we'll do it again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.